Whatever happens in Barcelona, Ducati will win the MotoGP Riders' Championship again, but this one will probably taste a fair bit different. Jorge Martin, who is leaving Ducati at the end of this year, is on the verge of taking the title, of defeating Pecco Bagnaia, the chosen one, the rider who is staying. Simon, is the impression in the MotoGP paddock that Martin has overcome a certain Ducati favoritism in favor of Bagnaia? Or has Ducati run a super fair title campaign, potentially to its detriment?
I think the latter is absolutely true. Ducati have been so fair through this title fight, or so obviously trying to give the impression of fairness that it has, if anything, worked against them, because at the end of the day, you have to imagine the factory don't really want Jorge Martin to win this championship. They don't want the number one plate disappearing off to Aprilia at the end of this season. They want Pecco Bagnaia, their factory rider, to retain that status going into another season. But they've done everything they possibly can to resist any possible accusation of favoritism towards him. There has been no talk of team orders. There has been no talk of performance limitations for Martin, even though he's leaving for a different factory at the end of the year, and that's something that would be completely normal in any other circumstance. They've played this fight as absolutely fairly as they can. There's been a few moments where we've seen maybe people within the company favor one over the other, but you have to remember that people like Davide Tardozzi, who you see publicly and vocally on TV sometimes, isn't a Ducati employee. First of all, he's the manager of the factory team, so there's going to be a little bit of bias in his behalf. But whenever it comes to people like Ducati course racing boss Gigi Dall'Igna, or even factory company CEO Claudio Domenicali, there's been a real urge to not show favoritism towards either one of their title contenders.
Do you feel they could have done something? Because, I mean, contractually, Pramac, the satellite team, which is leaving for Yamaha next season, by the way, so that's also part of the discussion here. Contractually, Pramac is entitled to the same bike, but there are ways of making the same bike not go as fast.
There's a lot of reading between the lines within the word same, isn't there? There's a lot that they could do if they really wanted to make sure that the Pecco Bagnaia had a little bit of an advantage without, honestly, anyone even really knowing outside the factories. There's so much that can be done, even electronically, to just remove a few horsepower here in the name of saving engines, to, making sure that new components come a little bit later because production delays within the factory. There's things that can be done to slow them down. And from what we've heard, both from Ducati and from Pramac and Jorge Martin's side of the camp, none of that has happened whatsoever. There has been no bias shown one way or another. There has been no favoritism. There's been no delaying or slowing down. There's just been the full support that there's been all season.
But yeah, it could still win, mathematically speaking, but the likelihood is not so high. There's, if Martin does get this over the line, there'll be a double PR blow here. As you mentioned, the number one plate will leave the Ducati Lenovo bike of Pecco Bagnaia. We don't know for 100% yet whether Martin would take it with him to Aprilia or still around the 89, but I think the chances that he would take it are very, very high. So that's one part of the PR blow, and the other one is it would be a rider winning who Ducati publicly, indirectly, but basically declared, surplus to requirements. They went out, they got him, and then they had the option to bring him into the works team. He was begging him to do it. They didn't do it, and now this rider might win the championship, might beat the guy who they've extended instead of him. So for you, Simon, do you think the potential PR blow of those two factors, does it outweigh the PR blow of being seen putting your thumb on the scale, of making this a less fair title fight, and of people seeing that? Or would that be forgotten with time?
I mean, first of all, if I was Aprilia, the first thing I'd be doing would be extending an offer for another few €100,000 to make sure that Martin ditches the 89, which isn't really even his number anyway. His number is traditionally 88, and he only runs the 89 because Miguel Oliveira got there first. So take the number, run it, run the number one plate in the Aprilia, and take the PR win from that without even having to reference it, without having to say anything about it. Just have it on your bike, because it is a PR blow to Ducati that they won't have the reigning world champion on their machine next year. And honestly, I think it's a bit of a short-sighted one. I think if there was a little bit of interference, especially if it was quiet, if it was the sort of interference that no one outside the factory really knew was happening or couldn't definitively say. We are talking the minor bike upgrades, not the famous or infamous mapping 8 team orders saga from a few years ago. If they were to do something like that, it would have helped Pecco Bagnaia win the championship, to defend his crown, to make sure that the rider that they sacked doesn't win the championship before him and his team leave for different manufacturers. It would be PR sense. And honestly, I think it's probably testament to Ducati and to the fairness of Gigi Dall'Igna in particular that they've chosen to take the moral high ground and risk not a PR disaster, but a fairly substantial PR loss whenever there's no need for one, in return for walking away with their head held high and their hands clean.
That tees me up nicely into what is, I think, a bit of an incendiary question, because if you're a neutral MotoGP fan, you don't really have that much of a reason to be happy with Ducati. I mean, Ducati has basically cancelled the last 3 championships as anything. The Ducatis have been dominating this season. They're finishing, locking out the top 4, top 5, top 6 every time on Sunday. You don't have to be too happy with them. But as a neutral fan, should you actually be grateful that it is Ducati instead of, some of the other manufacturers potentially? That it is Ducati putting itself in a vulnerable position that it doesn't have to be in. It's its bikes. Ultimately, it could just shut off the Jorge Martin bike if it so felt.
I mean, the one good thing about Ducati domination at the minute is that, as we've said before, is the fact that there's 8 of them. Because at least it means there's a good bunch of competitive racing at the front of the grid, and it's not just 2 bikes disappearing off into the distance every weekend the way it could be. But I think that there's, they deserve some credit for what they've done this season in keeping the championship fight alive until the end. Because as dull, arguably, as this season has been in time, with uninspiring racing on occasion and all those red bikes at the front, the fact that we're going into the final round with the title fight still on the cards is, that is something that Ducati could have potentially influenced. It's something that they could have prevented from happening and would have been arguably the smartest move for them to have done, but they didn't do it. They kept that title fight alive. They've kept delivering the entertainment for us. And, whether you might love them or hate them for their current domination of the sport, at least they're giving us back a little bit of something by keeping that fight going.
Without naming names, do you think other manufacturers would have done the same?
No, not at all. I think if it had been another manufacturer in the same position, then there would absolutely have been interference of some sort or another. I think that Ducati are in the comfortable position where they can afford to let this happen to an extent because of their domination of the sport right now. And, they've probably got a fairly good feeling that Pecco Bagnaia and Marc Marquez, his new teammate for next year, will take the title back. And maybe it's something of a gift to departing Jorge Martin and a subtle reminder that he's off to a factory where they don't expect him to be a title challenger, because the Aprilia just isn't there to the same level anymore. This is not Valentino Rossi departing Honda to go to a Yamaha that everyone thinks might be able to win the championship with the right rider on board. There's not that same recognition of any of the other factories at the minute having that chance of winning next year. So maybe they've just, conceded that it will still be a Ducati who wins this season, even if it's not a factory rider, and the scales will reset themselves in 9 months' time whenever it becomes very, very apparent that it can only be a Ducati that wins the championship again next year.